Hello everyone, welcome back to the Christ MotoGP Podcast, and this week we thought we'd talk about Honda. We've talked about the front of the grid plenty, but when you say Honda in the back of the grid, it comes as maybe a shock, but over the past maybe 5-6 years, the decline has been there for Honda and HRC, and this really is to discuss how they can get back towards the front of the grid. Joining me, Jordan Moreland, is Pete McLaren and Lewis Duncan. Lewis, it's difficult to analyse where and pinpoint the moment where exactly went wrong for Honda over this last half a decade, but we can look back at last year because it's the closest thing we have, and it's arguably the worst season they've ever had in the modern MotoGP era. 75 points, rock bottom of the constructors, their factory team being comfortably outscored by the satellite Honda team. Where's the positive in this? That's what I'm trying to get at. Is it going to get better, or is it a time of waiting for them?
I think the positive is that it can't get any worse, really. It's the third winless season in 5. Like I say, Jordan, rock bottom of the standings, didn't even crack a century of points last season. Even Yamaha managed that with 2 less riders. It's, the Honda situation is obviously it's pretty much hit its nadir. They lost Marquez at the end of 23. They lumbered along really in 2024. There was, a little bit of progress towards the end of the season, especially with Zarco, but you're then kind of in a position where was that the rider kind of getting more out of the bike than the bike actually making a bit of a step forward. I mean, Zarco was pretty positive about it, but, it's really hard to kind of gauge. They've made some big changes over the past few months and over last year as well, which kind of hint towards them finally unlocking one of the kind of biggest barriers that Honda has had, which is its quite stubborn mentality. They've done quite a massive thing in bringing in a European technical director, which I think is maybe the first time ever that's happened, certainly in the modern era, with Romano Albesiano coming over from Aprilia, a man that knows full well what it's like to develop a bike from being back of the grid joke to being a race winner, eventually. So that's a good move. They got Aleix Espargaro as a test rider, which, reinforcing that relationship that he had with Albesiano is a good move, as well as having a race ready test rider, essentially, which is, you look at all the other manufacturers, that's what they're doing now. That's been kind of a key part of their success. So there are at least positive signs going forward with Honda, but yeah, you look back over the past 5 years and you kind of really, the point at which it went wrong was that Spanish Grand Prix 2020 when Marquez broke his arm, and really Honda's kind of strategy for that, for that kind of really last decade before that point was that we have a bike, Mark's good on the bike, let's not touch the bike too much because we don't want Mark to lose his edge. But obviously we saw over those, especially 2017, 18, 19, the other Honda riders struggled massively, and that was really exposed after Marquez was injured. And then they tried to change course and try and build a bike that was a bit different, a bit more rider friendly for everyone else, and it was the worst thing that Honda's ever done. So that's the point they're at now. They're really trying to kind of dig their way out of that hole, and it is a deep hole.
It is. It's a good point you mentioned about the previous years, because when I think about Stanley Pedrosa, those first few years when him and Marquez were teammates, they were not level matched, of course, but they could still get race wins, both of them. But when Pedrosa started dipping on the bike and he started struggling on it, that's when it kind of started raising to me, maybe this bike is going the wrong way, because you always think Pedrosa could magic something on the Honda, especially because of his stature, and he could always make the tires work at certain races, and it never really materialized in the final few years. And then obviously you say Marquez is masking it massively with his talent, and then as you said, a key point, Marquez gets injured, and then they don't have anyone to kind of mask the issue anymore. And Lucio Cecchinello said recently they kind of did nothing during that 2020 period. Obviously they couldn't because of engine freezes and stuff, but still, other teams were trying little things with aero to not be as bad, essentially. But yeah, it's difficult, isn't it, Pete? Because as Lewis said, changing culture is something that eventually came along here with the Aprilia signings. But Is it something we're gonna have to wait for, maybe till the 2027 regulations to fully see it in effect? Because 2025, I don't think it's gonna be that much different compared to last year.
I mean, yeah, if it was an easy fix, they would have done it, wouldn't they? And, I think what the best they can hope for is to make steps towards a solution. And as you say, it might take until these whole new bikes come along in 27 to actually get the big step then. But certainly they'll aim to make steps towards it. We've heard the rear grip issue, haven't we, for years, stretching back to Marquez era when you guys were just talking about. And even at the start of this year, wasn't it? It was still the kind of the traction on the exit of corners, lack of acceleration. But then by the end of the year, they kind of it had evolved a bit, hadn't it? And it was more about grip control, and it was more about entry to the corners and things like that. So it seemed like that they kind of were able to pinpoint the issue, which is half the battle, isn't it? Is knowing, well, what is it exactly? Because we'd heard for years, Marquez is losing on acceleration, and the Honda riders are losing on the way out the corners. We heard it even at the start of testing last year that was the big issue. And then, by the end of the year, they realised, hang on a minute here, we're actually... The problem is coming from earlier in the corner. We're seeing it later on the exit, but we're not getting a good enough corner entry. We're not, the mid corner isn't good enough. So hopefully for them, that this sort of grip control, as I think Zarco has called it, is what they need to improve. And they had a swing arm, I think, towards the end of last year that helped a bit with that. They had that new aero that was good in the fast corners. But then, the engine improved, but it didn't have enough power, did it? Because it got more rideable, but that classic case of make it more rideable, but you lose the top end on it. So they were sort of lacking a bit of engine power as well. So I think, that they've got a better idea of what they need to improve, but now they have to really work on it. And that's the tricky bit. Max Bartolini, the Yamaha technical director, they're in a similar situation, aren't they? They're facing similar issues. And he explained the same thing. You've got to maximize the rear grip, but actually what looks like a traction problem is really coming a lot earlier in the corner, and it's harder to do that. It's harder to fix a problem with the bike turning and the corner speed side of things. So I think both Japanese factories, they've got a similar issue, haven't they? And to solve, the Europeans have obviously made a step with all of the aero and the ride height devices, which is helping them on the exit, and maybe that's also masked things, made it more difficult. But as I was saying, getting Albesiano in, someone who's really pushed the aero envelope, isn't he, in a sort of the ground effect side of things. Definitely they've got him on board. They've got let's remember, not only Albesiano and Espargaro, but Antonio Jimenez, the crew chief, in the middle. So I can't remember anyone ever getting the full range, if you like, of we used to riders and crew chiefs moving, but actually getting rider, crew chief, and the technical director. So they've really got the complete extreme of bike development there, haven't they? They've got the guy on the bike telling you this is what it's doing, the crew chief interpreting that into sort of engineering language, and then the technical director who's in charge of sort of solving those problems. So they really have got all those guys on board, and of course Takagi Nakagami as well, who can help with the communication side with HRC. That was another area that we'd heard, wasn't it, during the year, that really they have to improve the communication between the factory in Japan and the race team. And Nakagami, he speaks great English. He's lived in Europe for a long time. He beat both Repsol Honda riders this year. If we'd have said in his rookie year, look, you'll beat both Repsol Honda riders, back in 2018 was it when he joined the grid, I think, you'll beat both Repsol Honda riders and lose your seat. I think people would have said, well, that's a bit harsh, but that was the situation he found himself in, wasn't it? So he certainly is still, the point is, he's still a fast rider, he's still a competitive MotoGP rider. He might not have got the trophies that Aleix has got, but he's got the speed there, and he's got that crucial communication that he can do with the Japanese engineers and really make sure they understand and what the riders are saying. And I think we don't quite know, do we, exactly what role Albesiano will play within this massive HRC organization. That's going to be interesting to see how they fit that in, because he is an addition, isn't he? They haven't sort of taken anyone away. Everyone else is still there. They're adding Albesiano to it, so we've got to wait and see how that all sort of works together. But let's see. It looks like they know what the problem is. They brought in some new guys. The idea seems to be, from what Marini was saying when I spoke to him at the end of last year, they want to try and keep that sort of quality that the Japanese, the Honda manufacturing, the details, the quality of the bikes, the consistency of the parts, all that kind of stuff, and sort of add in the European sort of the aggressive design approach. And they think that's going to be their way forward. It will be a unique way. It won't be copying. They were keen to point out, we can't just copy the Europeans. We've got to find our own way within Honda, and let's see if they can do it. But certainly the first thing I have to say is to avoid those mistakes. And Lewis mentioned it of Sepang last year and things like that, and getting off to a bad start with making radical changes to the bike that actually set you a step back rather than forward.
Yeah. Yeah, because that was going to be my next sort of thing to tee up. The key word here is direction. You can either go in the wrong direction or the right direction, essentially. And that, for half a season in 24, really cost them, didn't it, Lewis? Because, and it also, the direction, who leads the direction is also my thinking too, because you read it out there, the satellite team performed better than the factory team. And yes, they're all riding the same bike, but you wouldn't expect that. And I think people have kind of pinned Johann Zarco, and you kind of touched on it, Pete, with, he thinks that they found the issue and this is where it can be sort of worked on to progress and eradicate the issue. Who do you trust in this? Do you trust everyone like Ducati do, where they have the big pool of riders and they collate all the data from everyone? They're like, well, they kind of just make it work there, Ducati. That's a great system they have. But with Honda, do they still have that factory thing where you trust the two guys in your main team? Or they're going to have to start really listening to everyone, aren't they? That's how you make it successful.
It's a tricky one because obviously, if you remember at the end of last year at the test, you had Joan Mir saying, this was rubbish, didn't test anything new, really disappointed. Then you had Luca Marini being like, oh yeah, we tested new things. It was, it was positive. There'll be more new things on the way. And we kind of heard that quite a lot over last year. Was that Mir was a bit more critical of the bike and not making much steps forward. Marini was a bit more level-headed. And when you get in a situation like that, it's quite hard to understand if that's, who's telling the truth. Is one of them just being more diplomatic for the sake of, diplomacy? Is one of them, kind of not really understanding what it is they're actually doing or what the program is, or if it's not been explained to them properly? It's really quite kind of tricky to know. Again, at the end of that test, Zarco was the more kind of coherent of the whole Honda bunch. He was like, we tested some new things. It wasn't a great direction to go in, but that's fine because we need to make mistakes to understand what works. And, when you hear things like that and you just look at the general performance of Zarco last year, I think over half of Honda's constructor points were delivered by him, which, that's his first year on the bike. It's a pretty impressive.
It is.
Impressive thing. You kind of have to rally around him. He's the oldest of that rider lineup. He's got the most experience. He's got a good breadth of his experience as well. Yamaha, KTM briefly. A little bit of Honda as well. He did those few races at the end of 2019, so he kind of understands, or he knows a little bit about, where the bike used to be and where it is now. Obviously a lot of years on the Ducati as well. So I think Honda would be silly not to lean on Zarco as their kind of team leader, and especially this year is it's a contract year within the Honda stable. Marini's out of contract at the end of this year. Zarco's out of contract at the end of this year. There is, obviously from Zarco's point of view, he wants to probably earn at least one more year, if not a step up to the Repsol Honda team if he can. Well, sorry, the factory Honda team now. It's not Repsol Honda team anymore. I think he's kind of going to be the guy you put all your chips down on because he just has clearly emerged as the most level-headed. Mir. I'm not saying what Mir said has been wrong, but he's a world champion. He has obviously a lot of different expectations from himself than maybe someone like Marini does, for example, who hasn't been in that position to even win a Grand Prix yet. And, Zarco, who's been in the game a long time, has only won one Grand Prix in that time as well. So you need that kind of experience and level-headedness to really guide you forward. And I think, you do have, Honda will have to listen to all of its feedback for sure, but you've kind of got to, I think, put the onus on Zarco to take it in the direction he thinks it should go in, because that kind of already seems like it was the right direction. The aero tweak that they made, he was the first one to kind of make it look really quite like a good step forward. Remember in Indonesia, so I think you listen to everyone, but you put Zarco as your leader essentially.
Yeah, I agree. It's strange saying that because as you said, Lewis, Joan Mir, he's a MotoGP world champion. He's in that factory team. And just coming to Mir, Pete, how do you think it would have affected him in terms of seeing Marquez leave Honda when he did? His first year in the Repsol Honda team, and then Marquez leaves at the end of it. Do you think that kind of made him realise, well, if the guy who's been so successful on this bike and who's mastered it for so many years can't do it anymore, Like, how does that? How do you think that affects someone like a world champion? Because it must be difficult. Because Mir has only had one really good result, and that came in India in 23, where it was a weekend of unknowns where they all arrived, and the Honda seemingly worked around the track because it had been here before. The same for everyone else. It must be difficult because Mir wants to push, and we see him crash so many times in practice and in a race, and it's just a bit sort of not sad. It's just, you want to see the world champions up the front, but his sort of mentality is that he's pushing no matter what to try and fix the problem. But at times, unlike Zarco, who's just gathering the points and pushing it in the right direction, Mir's just kind of throwing it down the road, and it's difficult for a world champion, I'd say. I think that's fair.
Yeah, definitely. I think also, probably seeing Mark go so well on the Ducati would have been a positive for him. I think, having seen, hang on, not even Mark could win on this bike last year, and then suddenly he's competitive when he changes bikes. I think it depends how you look at it, but I think that he will feel, that underlines just how difficult this bike is. If not even Marc Marquez could regularly put this bike on the podium, and then suddenly he's getting 20 podiums on the year-old Gresini Ducati. Yeah. It shows the situation. I think Mir's, he was one that we saw the chatter thing, didn't we? Didn't affect riders equally within each manufacturer. We saw that Jack Miller suffered more than most of the guys at KTM. It seemed to be the guys that relied on corner speed that were hurt more. Nakagami really struggled, didn't he? I mean, he retired at Sepang because the chatter was so bad. He and Mir really seemed to be hurt by the chatter. So if there's three things that Honda need to work on, I think it would be obviously the rear grip or the rear control, however you want to call it, more engine power, and chatter. They need to get on top of the chatter thing. But it didn't seem to affect the riders equally. Mir really seemed to be hurt by it. I think at some tracks he was saying it was costing him like half a second in a couple of corners and that kind of thing. And I think there was frustration that as we saw with Jack Miller, that it lasted the whole season. That chatter issue you can't really do much about. The bike's bouncing around underneath you and you're just sort of waiting for it to stop, aren't you? So I think that didn't help. But certainly, Mir's in a difficult situation. He's been at the team for 2 years now, 1 year longer than Marini, as Lewis was saying. He's come in, pretty level-headed, knowing what it's going to be like. And Zarco, both Marini and Zarco really came in with a similar mentality, didn't they? That, look, this is going to be hard, but that's why I'm here, and we're going to build up. And I think with Mir, he's been at the very top of MotoGP, and he's eager to get back there again as soon as possible. Interesting as far as who do you have lead the project. I don't know whether when Repsol were the title sponsor, it was actually in the contract that their riders got the parts first. I'm not sure. Sometimes that's the case, but of course now they're gone. Potentially, they can be a bit quicker to maybe give the parts to the LCR team. Obviously, Chantra's the rookie on the other bike. That's not so important to give him the new parts. But maybe, I don't know. Maybe that was an issue in the past. We certainly, as you guys say, there were different spec bikes on track, weren't there? And it seemed like the older LCR bikes were sometimes more competitive than the newer parts that the Repsol Honda guys were using, etc. So we could certainly see a shuffle there with more equality of the new parts. It's going to be interesting to see also if they do take the Gigi Dall'Igna Ducati approach of trying to raise all the riders up almost equally, isn't it? And sort of every rider having not exactly the same weight of opinion, but a similar weight of opinion that sort of pays off in the longer term. Or do you go for that, throw everything at your strongest rider, which they did with Marquez, and as you guys have said, Zarco is the clear standout guy if you want to take that approach. I think they're going to probably go for a mix between the two, aren't they? I think it'll be a bit like what KTM say, which is we have 4 factory riders, but if we don't have enough parts, the quickest guys get it first. I would expect that to be the situation at Honda as well this year.
Yeah, and just going back to experience, I was speaking to the riders at Silverstone, for example, and like speaking to Marini and then speaking to Mir, it's like two contrasting people. Like you're talking about different engine specs they're running. It's like, then you talk to Zarco, he's running something completely different. Nakagami's on the oldest of them all. It's like, how do you create a direction here? And I think that's the key. I think that maybe Albesiano and to a degree, at least Espargaro will probably looking in, will probably go, well, if we get everything on the same level that you can all ride, and I think it even goes back to Paul Espargaro and the Marquez days. They said it, they got the tests and there was like 3 riders trying completely different things, and it's all what they liked. But then when they came to a certain track, it wouldn't work, and they'd all be all over the place. And I think that it's just the direction of getting something that works for everyone is the key here. And like you say, Pete, the other factors of finding how to manage grip and just make the bike more rider friendly essentially is something that needs to happen. And a time frame for that, I don't know how you can put time on something like that, because it's like you almost need a regulation change, Lewis, to have something to make it fresh again, if that makes sense, because that's what Honda have kind of looked at in the past, where you see a regulation change. They've always been kind of the team that innovates. I think back to the gearboxes and stuff they had, the seamless gearbox, and they always got it right then, but it's so different now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you do sorry, you do have to kind of wonder at what point does Honda switch full focus to 2027, because there is an opportunity over the next couple of years to close the gap, because there is this development freeze on engines for everyone that isn't Yamaha and Honda. So that's something that would help them quite a lot. But equally, if those manufacturers have got an engine freeze, then they are going to be able to start diverting their resources to 2027. So Honda kind of has quite a difficult, and Yamaha as well, they have quite a difficult kind of path in front of them, because they do have to kind of develop themselves to a point where you can't go into a new regulation cycle and not have a good base to work from, because then you've set yourself up for an even longer term fail. But you can't really commit too much to the current project when it is going to be obsolete very, very quickly. Ducati's already talking about having its 850cc engine prototype on track at some point this year. Yeah. You can't be getting your engine on track first time next year. Obviously, Yamaha has an even more special case, because they're looking to develop a V4 as well as an inline 4, and possibly even having to develop an 850cc without even knowing if it's going to be a V4 or an inline 4. So at least Honda doesn't have that situation, but there will come a point where Honda has to go, okay, we just have to bite the bullet on 25, 26 and put everything into 27. Because also, if you look at look at the last time we had a major kind of regulation shake-up, they didn't hit the 1000cc era particularly well. Casey Stoner hated that bike. Had a lot of chatter. It was really aggressive. Part of that was due to the kind of Bridgestone tires as well at the time. But Honda, kind of didn't have the easiest year in 2012. It looked better than it was on paper, because the competitive landscape at the time was, if you were on a Yamaha or a Honda factory, you're going to win. Yeah. That's not the case anymore. You remember when we went from 990s to 800s, Honda really got it wrong. The first couple of years, of the 2-3 years really was a bit of a nightmare for them. So Honda does also have a history of kind of not really getting the jump. Whereas, you look at you look at the Yamaha, for example. We went from 990 to 800. The M1 was great, and again with the 1000s, we went to, and they won the championship. Both of those years that we had those big regulation changes. So, yeah, the Honda has quite a tricky task ahead of it as to how much it kind of puts into the project, that it needs to get to a better position, but also at what point do they go, okay, everything we do now is for 2027.
Yeah, I'd love to give our listeners an answer, but I just don't know. Like, this is the thing, and another factor added in, they've no title sponsor this year, Pete. And when you say you get rid of Repsol, I mean, they're probably the biggest contributor of a sponsor to any team across the whole paddock, and they're gone. It's strange, isn't it? Because, like, who can fill that void? And it kind of shows that maybe this was stemmed from Marquez leaving, massive Spanish company, having the big Spanish star on their bike, and he was winning for them all the time, and he leaves. Honda and Repsol just kind of seem to drift ever since that, haven't they? Because the sponsorship was reduced almost on the bike in 24. It was smaller. They're not even here this year. They don't have a title sponsor as we record this. It's not been officially confirmed. They're just Honda HRC now. So that has to play into it as well, budget-wise, would you say? I know Honda aren't struggling for money. I know that now, but it's still a thing, isn't it?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, it's obviously a blow, but if any factory can absorb it, it's Honda HRC, isn't it? And I think interesting listening to Lewis there, running through the history of Honda and where they've struggled, and it sort of reminded me that they have this sort of, they like to win at the end of a set of rules, if that makes sense, don't they? End of the 500cc era, end of the 250s, end of the 990s, and here we are. So we don't quite know exactly where MotoGP fits on the radar of Honda. This comes back to your question about the budget being such a huge company. And it could be that having had all these years of losing, if you like, and hitting this rock bottom and seeing this new set of rules coming, that from an engineering pride point of view almost, that as we've seen several times in the past, they're actually going to go, you know what, we need to show that we could master this set of technical rules before it all changes. Because it is interesting, as Lewis raises the point, that when there's been a change of rules, it's actually not often worked out too well for them at the start. It's actually been at the end of the rule cycle that they've usually sort of been at their strongest, and then they've had to take a step back and build up again. So they're running out of time now, aren't they? But we could see, and maybe the losing Repsol is another thing that will just give a nudge to the people at the upper end of Honda to say, look, we need to get on top of this as Honda. We know they're very proud of their engineering tradition and everything else. And so let's see the reaction. This could be the loss of Repsol, the coming to the end of this era of technical rules. It could be that they want to show to the world that, hang on, we can master this. We can make ride height devices work. We can make aero work and everything else that isn't going to be there. Certainly the ride height devices from 27. I think it'd be interesting to see if it does sort of almost sting them into a bit of a reaction.
It can, because like you say, Honda always just kind of have this pride of, I mean, racing is their DNA, isn't it? They just, the HRC and the way that brand and style structure works, they want to win everything. But I don't know. I don't know if they have the. It's difficult for me to say, because I always think back in the past they had the riders to do it. I think the pull of Honda for so many riders was like getting Casey Stoner, for example, getting Marquez, and having Danny Pedrosa for so long was such a key to all that. And even going back to when Rossi was there, that kind of stung them as well when Rossi left, because they kind of assumed the bike would do all the winning, and it didn't. They needed the rider there, which Rossi proved. Do you think that's fair to us?
Yeah, well, the Rossi point is really, really valid, because the reason he left was because Honda put so much emphasis on the fact that it was the bike doing the winning and not the rider. And then he went to Yamaha where the bike wasn't doing the winning, and then him and Jeremy Burgess especially transformed that whole thing. And I think that's kind of been Honda's problem over the years. You remember kind of quite early on into Marquez's absence, I remember at the time Alberto Puig saying, it'd be easy for other riders to win now because Mark's not here.
That's right.
No, it's not going to be a valid championship because Mark's not here. That's what he said. And I remember speaking to Wayne Rainey at the time of that, and he was like, well, first of all, Alberto needs to remember that his first win, and its 500cc win, came when Mick Doohan crashed out of the lead, but also, like, there are just points in a championship you can't control who's there and whatnot. And I think that's been Honda's biggest problem, is that they've sort of, when things have gone wrong, they've always leaned on the fact, well, we've won more championships, over the last sort of blah blah how many years. And then you go, okay, so you had Valentino on the bike in a 990cc era that was obviously at the beginning of that era, and you look at the grid back then and the competitiveness of the grid, especially that 2002 season, for example, half the grid was still 500s. 2003, like, those couple of years, it wasn't the best of grids, and even 2001 as well, when Rossi won, it's not the best of what MotoGP can be. Hayden, I think Hayden's championship is a bit more of a representative of a rider really just kind of going for it, because he kind of wasn't the fancied rider for that whole season, and yet he did it. But then you're right, they had Pedrosa on the bike. Okay, Danny didn't win the championship, but Danny's an alien. Then they got Casey on the bike, and look what Casey did on that Ducati for all those years. I mean, Ducati kind of then was in that similar situation where it was like, oh, well, the bike must be quite good because we're winning, but then you lose the guy who's doing the winning, and it's like, oh no, this is actually quite bad. Yeah. So you got Casey to win, and then Mark comes along. Like I say, at the start of that 1000cc era, Casey didn't like the bike, they struggled a lot. Mark comes along, wins the championship straight away, dominates the next year, and it's like, oh, well, clearly we're fine. And it's kind of like Honda, then Honda conveniently forgets 2015, for example, where the bike really was bad and Mark couldn't ride it, and Mark couldn't figure out how to ride it, and he lost the championship. And then 2016, the bike wasn't brilliant, and then Mark made it work. In 2017, remember the start of it, he said, the first half of the year, I was losing hair. I was
losing
stressed.
hair, that's right. Yeah.
It was that much of a problem.
For our listeners, Pete just pointed at his own head there. So if you're watching,
I have the same problem.
Honda have always had that. The 2018 bike was difficult. The 2019 bike was really bad. You look at where the rest of the Honda. Look at Lorenzo. For
it's
example.
Essentially the bike that retired Jorge Lorenzo.
Well, exactly. So you look at all these things, and Honda have kind of had this overinflated sense of, well, we've done a good job, and everyone's like, well, you've had the best rider, and then when the best rider's not there, it really exposed them, and they haven't recovered from that. It's been 5 years now, and they have not recovered from that. Mark came back and won some races in 2021, but they were circumstantially won races on mostly left-handed tracks, and then, there was a second Misano race, which obviously always created a bit of or masked kind of the reality of things when he had those back-to-back races and at the same tracks in COVID times. But you look at 2022, terrible. You look at 2023, terrible. You look at the last year, terrible. Honda, I think, for a long time have really kind of not been able to understand where the genuine flaws of the bike are, because they've had all these riders who've just been able to mask it. And as I said at the start of the podcast, you don't want to then create anything that's too different for those riders, because if they can't win on the bike, then it's like, well, we should have done that in the first place. So they've, for the first time really for a long, long time, they're really out in the wilderness. And I think we're kind of starting to really see the real cracks in Honda's entire infrastructure, really, and working ethos of the actually maybe they don't know how to build genuinely brilliant bikes, because they don't have genuinely superstar talents on those bikes anymore. So this is really going to be an interesting period that will kind of ultimately come to define Honda, I think, in Grand Prix racing as a whole. Yeah,
because it's, when you think about, I've one defining image in my head of maybe the past 5-6 years, and it's Marquez after the warm-up crash at Sachsenring in 23, where it was his 5th crash of the weekend. It was the one that ultimately ruled him out of that race. And there's a broadcast shot, you can go back and watch it if you have video pass, and it's his eyes. He's got the visor up, and you can just see his eyes. He looks like he doesn't know what has happened, and he's all these years of being successful on a bike, and it's like at that point for him it clicks. I can't ride this thing anymore. It's like, and I think that summed it up to me. There's obviously the clip of him where he's sitting on his knees almost, and he's hunched over, and he just looks defeated by the bike. And I think if you're going to have the most successful MotoGP rider that you've had at Honda, who is slumped on his knees, he's injured, he's came back from arm surgery, he's been through all this, and he can't do it. And then, like you say, Lewis, he goes on to a Ducati the year after, and the talent's still clearly there. I think it shows the sizable challenge that the Honda actually have. And, I hope they can fix it, because I just want it to be not nostalgic. I like seeing Honda at the front. I don't know what it is. Growing up, always been at the front, no matter if it's in World Superbike back in the day when I was younger, or it was road racing with Honda's always been at the front, and even in MotoGP. I think they will get it right, but the key message I'm trying to get across here, I don't have a time frame. I don't know when it is. If it's going to be 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years, who knows? And that's the point. I think we've discussed a lot of good points here on where they can go, but it's how and will the new management and the new infrastructure they're trying to implement really work. And I suppose we can wait until the start of the season and testing. But yeah, let us know your thoughts in the comments below on Honda's situation. It'll be interesting to read what you think. Listen, if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, give us a review. Helps out massively on the charts. And yeah, we'll be back next week for, I think we'll probably do maybe a look at some of the liveries and the team launches, because it's quite busy over the next week. We've got, I think, 4 or 3. So we've got Gresini, and then we've got the official Ducati, and obviously Trackhouse and Aprilia are in there as well. So we've got plenty to talk about. And yeah, join us next time, and we'll see you then.